So today is about celebration and challenge. So we've had an absolutely fantastic celebration of research in the arts and humanities through the early parts of the day. This closing session is about the future of the arts and humanities at York. I guess we might want to frame it around a challenge. So I'm a philosopher, just thinking about my own discipline. So there was a time when philosophy was the queen of the sciences. In the 17th century, there was still this view. So if you look at the work of René Descartes, he was a philosopher, mathematician, scientist. His science started from the proof of the existence of God, right? A work for a philosopher to do. And from the existence of God, he derived his physical laws of the universe. So you still get something like this view later on, even into the 20th century. So Edmund Husserl, the founder of the phenomenological movement, wrote a book in his final work in the 1930s, The Crisis of the European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology. So his view in the 1930s was that the sciences had run aground, right? They were in serious trouble because they hadn't looked at the presuppositions of what it was they were thinking. So times change. I guess if Husserl was to write that book today, it would probably have to be The Crisis of the Humanities and Transcendental Phenomenology. So I'm sure we're all aware of the challenges facing the humanities. So school curricula, recruiting students to universities, the funding landscape. And I guess this is all reflective of, but perhaps also underpinned by kind of wider discourse about the humanities. So that's kind of partly by way of challenge, but this is supposed to be a celebratory event. So what we've got in our final session, we've got two speakers who are going to tell us about how we can overcome these challenges and think about the value of the humanities. So our two speakers are Professor Tom McLeish, Professor of Natural Philosophy in the Department of Physics, also Centre for Medieval Studies and the Humanities Research Centre, and Helen Smith, Heads Department and Professor in the Department of English and Related Literature. So Tom's going to start us off, and then we'll hear from Helen.
Good. I wasn't actually sure who was going to start off still this minute, so it's been a day full of surprises, hasn't it? So and it's been a wonderful, wonderful day. And as I said some last week, let me before I say anything else, thank the Humanities Research Centre and York Humanities scholars generally for the welcome I've had there last year as a sort of interloping scientist, transgressing boundaries, being very weird. It's been an exercise of academic hospitality par excellence that I've beyond anything else I've experienced. I'm having a huge amount of fun. So thank you very much indeed. And so in that's the frame in which it now begins to look rather strange when we see, perceive and have re-rutted over and over again by our discourses this division between the arts and humanities and the sciences on the one hand. And I have to say, after a day like today, you didn't organise it that way, right? But from the very first, from Divner's astronomers and paleographers, we had Damon's extraordinary technological creativity, and Cobin's transgressing from to discourse analysis into zoology and biology in the most natural way. I mean, today of all days illustrates how when we start diving deeply into the questions that concern us, the closer we get to the disciplinary boundaries, they begin to dissolve before us. And we end up the wrong side of them before we've sort of sneezed. And I was reminded by another boundary that a wise historian of science pointed out once, that if there are persistent boundaries where intellectually which we decry and don't think they should be, yet they persist, it's probably because at some level, they're too much in people's interests that they persist. So one of the provocative questions is: look, if we're all still rolling our eyes at the two cultures division, and yet it still persists, we might be involved in a little bit of hypocrisy here. And if we are, I'm sure the scientists are far worse to blame than the humanities. Another thing, by the way, the scientists are far more to blame than the arts and humanities scholars is to become silent. I'm tempted to use another analogy and say eclipsed after that lovely presentation by Divna. There is an entire hemisphere of the planet of science that has become eclipsed and fallen into darkness in scientific discourse, and it's the part of the scientific story which requires imagination, ideation. You know what's coming around the corner. McLeish is going to sell his book again, but not really. It goes the other way around. You see, I'm sure you all know. You don't write, but you write books you've got to, because you haven't got time to do them unless they write themselves. You know, with a sort of energy. And when I had heard for the umpteenth time the claim, most sadly in schools, that science doesn't require imagination, has no creative human impetus at all. I knew the discourse had to be changed, because this is a terrible narrative. It's a terrible eclipse, and now you can see why it is, because we in the sciences we do cling to our methodologies, don't we? We do like our conjectures and refutations, and even if we have to let go to Popper, we cling to Kuhn, straight away. And if we have to let go to Kuhn, we cling to Lakatos, we cling to Feyerabend, we cling to something, even if it's against a method. We want a method. But creativity knows no method, and so it's remarkable to be in a university that's decided that creativity is one of the themes, and that could not be speaking to science at a more salient time. So the answer, those of you who've had the pants bored off them by me talking about poetry, music, and science, is yes. When you get scientists a little bit loosened up, out come the narratives of creativity aplenty. And they are narratives. They are stories. They're human stories with the ups and downs and despair and the emotional contours of any of this deeply human, extraordinary desire to create what is new, what has never been there before. So that's the blurring boundaries, and why these boundaries exist is my first question. The second point takes off from the narrative first one and responds to Mary Leng's extraordinary contribution today, where the number 2 was, I think I forgot this right, Mary, if she's online or somewhere, allied to Sherlock Holmes. In number 2 itself becomes, in some sense at least, fictional. And this is no longer a surprise to me, because the practice and the story of science, particularly experimental science or reconstructed science, and the work of the human creation of fiction, even at the level of detail of the early moderns, the 17th century being the cradle of both the early English novel and the method we now call experimental science. And why that is not a coincidence, why that is part of the zeitgeist, and why fiction and science, and now from today, mathematics too, have deep entanglements. It is both deeply true, but very little drawn on by the sciences, because just as creativity and emotion are words that science has tended to turn its bright face away from and lead in its eclipsed half, so is the non-pejorative sense of fiction. Fiction is good, right? Okay, third point. I'm throwing these things out. I'm hoping we get more questions out of this section. Going to get people angry or something. Third point, history of science. Someone said something very, very wise. Is it JT Welch about the history of science today as a meeting point? And I'm sure that in not only our undergraduate education, but I'm very much hoping to see in our sixth forms in our ridiculously fragmented school system, history and philosophy being history of subjects, being particularly of sciences, being grounds over which both the the sciences and the humanities can play. And for me, some of the most interdisciplinary fun I've had has been in looking at the history of ideas and the philosophy of ideas, in my case in medieval science, as you know, but people like Hasok Chang in Cambridge are doing the same for late 18th century, early 19th century science, and giving the lie to this other scientific pretense that Howard Gardner once put it, you know, the scientific imagination, unlike the humanities, he says, is profoundly linear. It's not circular. We aren't interested in history because history is past. All new science is present and future. It's very wrong. It's very wrong. It turns out that when the history of science is revisited in an interdisciplinary mode, it becomes utterly and presently fruitful for new scientific ideas. So that's a third area, both for teaching and research, taking the history of science and science together in a much more entangled way. And finally, poetry. I was so delighted to see that we kicked our day off with poetry. And had you noticed, there's something both, well, there's two levels which I think we can address poetry and science. One is, or we must revisit Wordsworth's vision, Wordsworth's disappointed vision. In his famously quoted, overread preface to the third edition of Lyrical Ballads, the day will come when the poet will be no less moved by the products of science as by any other field of human emotion. He saw it happening, but made it conditional and saw that this would only happen if the results, the ideas, the thoughts, the finding of science become as familiar to us as any of our other human activities, as experiencing, hoping, and suffering beings, particularly the suffering in the context of science. I think it's very important there. So it's a familiarity. Now, why did Wordsworth think that poetry was about familiarity? It was because Theseus and Shakespeare got there for him, of course. You know, according to Theseus, the poet's pen gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Well, that's what familiarity is. And I remember when I first read Theseus' words in Midsummer Night's Dream, Act 5, it one of those times when I thought, oh, that's science. I don't know why, it was a visceral reaction. That's science. Giving to airy nothing a local habitation and a name is the most beautiful description of what theoretical physics does. And it's not the only time for which I've seen poetry and gone, aha, form and creativity. What could call on the greatest power of emotional imagination to reimagine the structure of the entire universe? And what could constitute the greatest form than to have that imagination conform to the universe as we observe it? So science is sort of like writing a big poem. That's what I want to say, but I have no idea how to get there. Maybe the head of English can help me.
I will stand because I am in declamatory mode. I want to start, though, with warm thanks and an apology. So thank you for having me. Thank you to the HRC for organising such a great day, and more importantly, for the work the whole team do day in and day out to support and promote research in the arts and humanities, including, of course, the superb scholarship, which really is the future for us all, that of our doctoral students. Today has been a great occasion, showcasing the range of our research and doing so in a way that has allowed large-scale conversations to spring from minute details, taking us everywhere from hazelnuts to poetry, medieval science, climate change, and orangutan back and forth. So why should I apologise? Why did I look shifty when Keith said to me this morning, and then you're going to be talking about how and why the humanities are valuable? Because, and partly because it has been done so effectively by others already today, I'm not going to celebrate the arts and humanities. Ladies and gentlemen, the arts and humanities are part of the problem. The mean gender pay gap in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of York was 22.68% as of March 2018. To all intents and purposes, that means my female colleagues in this faculty, when compared to their male colleagues, stopped earning money in this calendar year last Thursday. So I'm going home. No. In 2018, Olivette Otele became the first black woman to be appointed a Professor of History in the UK. She remains the only black female Professor of History in the UK. There are 3 black female Professors of Literature in the UK, 2 black female Professors of Politics, no black female Professors of Politics, Philosophy, Music, Language and Linguistics, History of Art or Archaeology. Yesterday in Australia, 100 scholars received the welcome news that they had been awarded Australian Research Council Future Fellowships with a collective value of 87.8 million Australian dollars. 5 of those projects were Indigenous focused. None of those 100 new fellows is Indigenous. Closer to home, the AHRC published its diversity data for 2015 to 16. 1% of fund awarded went to Asian PIs, 1% to black PIs, 1% to Chinese PIs, 86% to white PIs, 4% other, 7% unknown. Studentships, 2% Asian, 2% black, 1% Chinese. A report published yesterday on barriers to black PhD students accessing Research Council funding reveals that over a period of 3 years, 1.2% of all UKRI-funded studentships went to black or black mixed UK students. Only 30 in total to students of a black Caribbean background, that's 0.15%. There are no available figures to tell us what number of UK academics are first-generation university students, how many identify as working class, how many attended Oxford or Cambridge. 5% of UK academics have a known disability, according to EHISA figures from 2017-18. That is against 18% of the working age population in Britain. We can't even award the Booker Prize, for God's sake, to a black woman for the first time ever without asking her to share it with a white woman. A great novelist, of course, but a woman given the prize in large part for a novel published 34 years ago, a novel which places the very real suffering of black women under erasure in order to imagine a dystopian future for middle-class American feminists. And in case you hadn't noticed, the world is on fire. Oh, the humanities. Here we are, caught between evils, desperate to prove the urgency and relevance of our study, and also absolutely impossibly convinced that flagrant, kaleidoscopic inutility is a great thing, that the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake is one of the highest goods to which we can aspire. The humanities make money, we cry. As a discipline, our combined labour and income have, in large part, subsidised our colleagues in the sciences to do their very valuable work. Creativity in the cultural industries is the biggest growth sector in the UK economy. The British Academy tries with all the urgency of an awkward schoolgirl to make the phrase "creativity is the fuel of the 21st century" happen. Define value, we grouse with our next breath, pointing out that the question of value is impossibly loaded, not to be answered by knee-jerk appeals to contemporary relevance or economic return. Surely the arts are, in some sense, all about how we articulate or imagine that which is precious, how we define in terms that have nothing to do with commercial application, everything to do with the biggest of big ideas: beauty, truth, wisdom. There is something in literature, music, art that has the capacity to touch us, to provoke emotion, to demand communication, to rework us in psychological and even physiological ways. But we in the humanities can't even embrace these abstractions as we once did. We have spent the past 40 or 50 years taking down, deconstructing, if you will, the idea that certain things are natural, inevitable, or desirable. Divisions based on gender, sexuality, race, for example. We have tackled the idea that anything can be held to be universal. We have queried what the humanism at the heart of our disciplines means, encouraged ourselves to ask how we can reject its central tenets as we respond critically and urgently to disability, prosthesis, infection, animal behaviour, and more. And I know there's a lot of problems in putting all those things in one list. You can take me to task later if you wish. At their most powerful, the humanities identify and challenge the inequalities that are hardwired into claims about the love of culture for culture's sake, or the good that the arts, traditionally restricted to an elite and used to police social boundaries and exclude the have-nots, can do. We can and we should fight to open up the arts and humanities. We won't do it if we're not willing to recognise that valuing knowledge, creativity, imagination is an act of tremendous privilege that all too often reinforces the walls we're supposed to be taking down. I have a lot of sympathy too for the critique launched by famous white man Bruno Latour. Having spent most of his career as a sociologist of science and technology, denaturalising facts and asking us to understand knowledge as constructed and contingent, Latour has more recently begun to worry that it is precisely that intangible thing, the most prized shibboleth of the arts and humanities, critical thinking, that has brought us to our current political moment of doublethink, obfuscation and conspiracy theory. As with the humanity, or rather let's remember the secular Greek and Latin humanity imagined by Renaissance male humanists that dwells within and troubles our discipline, we defend critical thinking in totally incompatible terms. Either critical thinking is a super useful skill highly valued by employers and therefore to be warmly applauded, or it is our superhero attribute as arts and humanities scholars whose exercise allows us not only to identify but, content warning, bad language, to skewer precisely this kind of neoliberal bullshit. It is also, post-Latour, now part of the cultural fabric in metastasizing and dangerous ways. We pride ourselves on seeing through it. We also need to recognise our part in creating a mode of thinking which insists that there is always meaning between the lines, that truth is always partial, that reality is, at the end of the day, interpretation. We might hate Brexit, folks, but are we sure it's not partly our fault? How do we imagine the future of the arts and humanities? This is the upbeat moment. One version, and I mean this very genuinely, powerfully presented by Henrika this morning, is this. Get our work out beyond the university, break down the boundaries between the academy and the community, radically expand our understanding of expertise to take in voices that are not our own and do not fit the post-romantic model of what seniority and expertise look like. But as Rupika Ripsam points out in her forthcoming book, Insurgent Academics, and here I quote her own recent synopsis, the strategies proposed as new solutions to save the humanities and the university are tactics of resistance that scholars of colour have been using for over a century to survive within the academy. Through necessity, Rissam argues, scholars of colour were interdisciplinary, multimodal and alt-ac, all before any of those terms became part of the academic lexicon, because they had to be. I am a literary critic. I can, and I'm not boasting, taxonomise irony 10 different ways before breakfast. And so I am aware of the irony of me, a middle-class white woman, standing up here instead of doing the work to invite someone both more insightful and with fewer opportunities handed to them to do the talking. I am also thoroughly aware that I'm neither the first, the only, nor the most articulate person to have had these concerns, which I know are shared by many people here and have been raised by powerful voices. In the spirit of the Cite Black Women hashtag, I want to name not only Rissam, but the brilliant Sunny Singh, Sarah Ahmed, and the iconic Kim Hall as just 4 of the scholars of colour who have made and continue to make these points more cogently and compellingly than I do, and at significantly greater personal risk. But I'm afraid my brief polemic is not going to end with the action it should demand. I should insist that we all resign on the spot, decamp to Heslington Hall, we can bring the drinks, and refuse to move until our positions have been filled by brilliant scholars from underrepresented communities. But I, like most people, am shackled by late capitalism, I have a mortgage, by my internalised love of the job I do, criticise wage labour as vocation, and by the heteronormative reproductive economy, also known as Anna. I don't have the courage of my convictions. So anyway, if we can't have the bonfire of the humanities, if we're not actually here to burn it all down, perhaps we can at least turn these few damp squibs into firecrackers. If we are collectively imagining the future of the arts and humanities, let's do it in practical, concrete, meaningful ways. Let's leave this room with a joint commitment to real representation among our staff, in our classrooms, on our visiting speaker schedules. Let's recognise that there is one way to move towards equality, and that is to put our money, real money, where our mouths are. Being not at all flippant, there is a good way to end the gender pay gap. It's called paying women more, and especially turning our attention to non-academic colleagues when we have this conversation. There is one way in which we will get BAME students into our classrooms, get rid of the achievement gap and see the pipeline fixed in a way that will make our professoriate meaningfully diverse. Bursaries, scholarships, support for early career academics, grants for those who need a flexible working model, publication subventions and opportunities for those whose voices have not been properly heard or properly valued. From where I'm standing, if the arts and humanities doesn't do some serious hard work to recognise how far we have limited what it means to be a humanist and what it means by consequence to be a human, if we don't expand our definitions to celebrate and amplify Indigenous and Black voices, scholars of colour, women, disabled academics, trans, lesbian, queer, asexual and every damn rainbow of scholarly variety that is out there, we don't deserve to have a future. But I look at our PhD students, I look at the students who fill our classrooms, I look at the passion my colleagues have for the work they do, and I really hope we do have a future we can fight for and that we can make a real and meaningful change. Thank you.
Okay, so we have about 20 minutes for questions.
Who dares? You Kate, thank you.
Okay, Helen, who's getting it right? Where should we look? You know, who's getting it right? Where should we look? Where can we look as a university in our position for inspiration, for advice, to share good practice? Who should we be talking to?
That's a brilliant question, Kate, and I don't probably have the answers, and it would be brilliant, I guess, if other people do have answers that they could bring to that conversation. I spotted, this is a very small one, but I did spot a scientific fellowship just the other day that is precisely to support women who need flexibility at particular stages in their careers. I thought that was a magnificent model of a grant.
Dorothy Hodgkin?
Yes, exactly, the Dorothy Hodgkin Award, which is a brilliant thing. The Folger Shakespeare Library, this is a very small one, because of their rebuilding works, they thought again about the model of the academic fellowship and needing to uproot yourself and travel across the world, and they've created fellowships that are actually to allow academics to be in their own places and living their own lives and doing their scholarship. But I think collectively, one thing we perhaps could do would be to think about where we can look to find these good examples. Thank you.
So if we're at an open day and we have a 17-year-old walk through the door with their parents and they're thinking about a humanities degree, and we're not conscious of what's been said, we don't want to talk about critical thinking in some glowing fashion. How do we justify the parents' suspicion of a humanities degree?
Okay, so I have two different answers to that, depending on whether I'm the head of department, or whether I'm me as head of department. We justified the study of the humanities by precisely appealing to the fact of just how wonderful the study is, just how brilliant York's reputation for humanities study is, how much it gives to students. I'm not against the idea of critical thinking. I am against the way we use the idea of critical thinking, but we do appeal to the sense of what it is that students develop as they read these texts. And I do want to appeal to good old-fashioned ideas about actually what a university education is and should be. And I suppose one of the places in which I feel most confident about universities is in thinking about the teaching we do with our students. There's nothing that irritates me. Well, there are lots of things that irritate me, but there's nothing much that irritates me more than the idea that we are not allowed to count as impact what happens in our classrooms, that impact excludes the influence that we have on our own students by current definitions. And so that sense of being able to sell to students, I don't find difficult. I think there are real truths about the ability of literary study to open up new worlds, to make people imagine in new and different ways, to find ways of articulating ideas, to build arguments, all of those brilliant things. I think that's true. I admit to more kind of difficulty and despair when it comes to articulating the value of humanities research, even as I love it and want to keep doing it. But I know this is meant to be an open discussion, and I think there might be other people who could give better answers to that question than I would.
First, I should just say that it's often, I'm often hearing in this sort of audience, or hearing the impression that the grass is so much greener on the scientific side of the fence. I just want to say it really isn't at all. That the sort of instrumentalist agenda is not what science degrees or science formation is about. It's about critical thinking. It's about stretching our minds around the most extraordinary ideas. And it's that primarily, if you like. It's not about how to make, it's not instrumentally how to make your life better. It's the sort of things that will make your life worth living in the first place. But we also find ourselves, of course, saying, physics is great because, and then we fall into that little line, not because the wonders of statistical mechanics and quantum mechanics and the extraordinary human ability to reimagine the structures of the world at length scales and energy scales that we cannot see, and it's just breathtaking. We can do this. We find ourselves talking about being utterly employable because of our, quantitative skills, and which is not a bad thing in itself, but the way what you've just said is beautiful. The way we cash that out is not quite honest, and it isn't that we shouldn't say it, but I think we should say something. And it's just I don't think we also take my analogy of the eclipsed moon half. There's an eclipsed part. There's nothing wrong with shedding light on the bright, employable side of what we're doing, helping young people have jobs. That's great. But there's everything wrong in eclipsing the other side of what we're about, which is liberal education, because we deeply believe that there's something that humanizes us about the humanities. And that's also true as science when seen through a humanities lens. I suppose one thing I wanted to say is that actually, sciences are humanities. But so that's another question, or answer to another question.
Could I ask both of you, from your slightly different perspectives, what you think about the subject matter of what we study in the arts and humanities. So, I mean, does what we study make a difference, and is that a kind of a route to change, both in terms of kind of your interest in bringing together the sciences and humanities, but also in terms of greater representation?
I mean, yes, I think that is something that we can and should do relatively straightforwardly, that efforts not just to decolonise, but to transform the curriculum and think about what's included and what's not included, and to think carefully about how we approach that in our classrooms. I had a student just today come to see me about something and talk to me about the idea that in a particular module, it was taken for granted that everyone had the kind of wishy-washy background Christianity that you kind of absorb. It doesn't matter whether you're religious or not, but the student coming from a very different culture found it a really alienating and difficult seminar because there were certain key assumptions made about the background knowledge they would have. And I think exactly those kind of efforts to think about what we're teaching in our classrooms and to make opportunities for people with different backgrounds to feel that those are important and relevant it makes a huge difference. That's part of the work of making things better and more diverse.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. I mean, and I do think, well, particularly in England and Wales, and perhaps not so much Scotland, we learn to think along or across or apart the other sides of the science humanities crevasse far too early. Actually, never would be better, and that impoverishes all of us. So I'm fascinated to see and have experienced the last 10 years in the interdisciplinary projects I've been involved in. Just fascinated to see humanities scholars rediscovering actually the hidden scientists in themselves. And it's been absolute delight. Let me put it that way around. I mean, of course, there are those of us who hope we're discovering the humanities scholars. Or, of course, it gives rises to huge expressions of masses. I mean, imposter syndrome, like you never. It's taken me 5 years to take my Bodleian card that I get because of a collaboration on my own to the manuscript and special collections 2 weeks ago. Honestly. So, and I couldn't quite believe that they weren't seeing straight, oh, you're just a scientist, I'm not handing these things over to you. You can't be true. It was going to happen any minute. I thought the police were going to come into the door. But there I was, spending an afternoon with extraordinary 13th century documents, actually leafing through them, and it was just a joy. Now, and I've seen humanities scholars discover extraordinary delight in that those sorts of wonderful realizations of when you see why it is that the spheres are so obviously there, and why it is so disastrously presentist to tut at the pre-moderns that they didn't adopt heliocentrism in an obvious way. And you have to get out there under the night sky for months and months and months to realise this. And you have to know a little bit about stellar parallax and the hugeness of the universe. But these are not beyond any of us, these little technical things. But we persuade ourselves that we can't do German, or that we can't do maths, or that we're tone deaf. And none of those things is true. And it's a sort of debility. We also inflict upon ourselves versions of the sort of non-diversity, I mean, much milder versions, but we disenfranchise ourselves by telling us we can't do things in ways just as poisonous, but less damaging ways than we poison certain people with particular backgrounds or particular skin colours, and they get subliminally messages that they can't do things because we all do this all the time. So I think that, to answer your question, Keith, a broader subject matter and a broader inculcation or formation of confidence and permission is something that I'd really love to see. And I would just to say the big hope is, you've mentioned early career researchers. The last few months here at York has been wonderful in finding that there are students of all stages, from undergraduate, masters, PhDs, who want to ignore the boundaries. And a few of us now knocking around, blurring the boundaries ourselves. Give those folk permission, and obviously give them supervisors too, and of course, in the most fantastic way. And I'm quite convinced that if we get this right, we can drop all this convincing that you don't belong in other ways than your wonderful, I'm tempted to say lay sermon, but it was really what it was, Helen, very important.
Hi,
Yeah, we got you.
Hi, I'm Amy Warbell. I'm visiting from the U.S. as a Fulbright Scholar this year. And thank you for your wonderful talks. And I think that the combination of your two talks was really evocative for me, because in the first we had this reminder of the love of epiphany. Everyone in this room who became an academic loves to have those moments of epiphany, wherever they come from, whether it comes from going deeper into our field or whether those moments come from going outside of our field and finding new relevance and context for what we do. Epiphany, empathy, these are the keys to what it means to be human, and to teach in the humanities is the promise that we can contribute to a society that is more humane, and I think we should never forget that. In all of the politics and all of the economics and all of the tearing down of what we do, coming at us from every direction, in the US and the UK, all over the world, and let's remember our colleagues who were imprisoned in autocratic states around the world right now because of the power of their ideas to take down these repressive regimes. So what we do is important, critically important, and at the same time we have these practical realities. And I teach in a very diverse public university in New York City, and I have many students of color, many trans students, queer students, and I would love to feed them into a pipeline that doesn't exist because there are no more full-time tenure-track jobs. And who am I helping? And I have these torturous conversations with them. I would love to encourage you to go on and get your PhD. And I don't want them to live in, like many of my colleagues in New York do, as starving adjuncts. And I'm not sure, I haven't been here long enough to know whether you have similar kinds of issues. And so,
we have our own version.
Yes. We need to fix the market. We need to empower faculties. And we need to remember that what we do, whatever your skin color, if you are teaching empathy, if you are teaching epiphany, if you are teaching a love of learning, what you do is important. And that's my comment.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Fantastic to have you with us, by the way, for this year. Hooray.
Thank you very much. Charlie Jeffrey, I was most interested to see Helen in declamatory mode there. And it was really, really thought-provoking, especially when you were pointing effectively to what it is we should be, what we should aspire to be, to some extent, despite what others tell us we should be. And I was very much taken by your thought about impact on students being a thing which perhaps is not valued by those who give us particular targets for impact in other ways. But I was also reflecting on what you were saying about how unrepresentative we are in the humanities across the whole university, frankly. We don't look like the society around us. Actually, our regulators would like us to look like the society around us. I think it's in our hands to try and challenge some of our own assumptions about what we do and how we do it. If we wanted to be more representative, to have more black and ethnic minority students and staff, well, it's in our power to do that. Might mean doing things in different ways. It might mean having to think differently about how we teach and tear up some of our practices. Might mean we have to spend some of our money in different ways and not in the ways that we do now and often rather quite enjoy. But if we want to be that, what we think we should be, let's go out and do it and make those choices about how we spend our money and become that which it is that we should be.
Yeah, good.
A few times already the word impact. Is it possible to say that maybe the impact agenda is a kind of a lifesaver for the arts and humanities?
No. I think because I think there are two different aspects to it. One is that I think real impact is something that is organic, holistic, hard to predict. That doesn't mean we can't make efforts to get out there and make things happen. It doesn't mean that it will happen if we just sit on our hands or if we simply do our academic work and let it kind of percolate out through some mysterious mechanism. But I think the way in which we are pushed to develop impact is potentially harmful, and potentially is not at all critical in its thinking about the kinds of, with obvious very honourable and very important exceptions, but is often not at all critical in its thinking about the kinds of ways in which people might wish to be impacted upon or impacted with or any of these other things. And I know many academic colleagues will share the frustration of going out to do impact at people who would be quite happy to be impacted on if they too had time, money and agency to kind of make that happen. So I think partly the way in which the impact agenda is framed is not against the idea that we would get out and that our work should be important, not for a moment, but the way in which the impact agenda itself is framed, I think becomes problematic in that way, or makes it difficult. And I think also that there is a whole industry in the arts and humanities of talking about how to have impact, which is a lot of arts and humanities academics paying a great deal of money to advisors in order to have conversations with themselves about how important they are, and I don't think that's very productive at all. But the idea that we would actually kind of have our work received as important and find ways to have conversations with people about it is not something I'm ever going to argue with. Yeah.
We ask our impact.
Sorry, Helen.
Well, one thing I would say, which I hope speaks to what you were saying earlier, Helen, is that the impact agenda, as currently presented, has created a new profession of impact officers and managers, which, as you all know, I am one. Like early career academics, quite a large number of us nationally have PhDs. I think we all probably have degrees. A lot of people have come into this profession because they can't get the jobs in academia that they are after. Well over 50% of people with jobs in impact are also on short-term contracts. So it has created a whole precarious sort of para-academic career structure of its own, which is also perilous and damaging for the long term and not helpful. So that's just what I have to add on that.
At the risk of making myself absolutely. But wildly unpopular, I want to put in a different tone about impact. I hear so much wailing and gnashing of teeth about impact, particularly in humanities faculties, and this is the one time I'm going to say it won't do. There's another narrative here. It's not all. I could say it could be so much worse. But let me just say a couple of things. The categories of impact that HEFKI that was now are enormously varied. There are about 35 or 40 of them. Most of those are almost never exploited, never used, and those are all there to open channels for humanities and arts. Second thing to say is that it's easy to venture over. It's easy for this rhetoric to turn into a privileged, frankly white, frankly male, exactly the rhetoric that Helen, you were most inveighing against before, because one of the aspects of a truly diverse, indigenous, very multicoloured academy is that such an academy, as Charlie told us, both reflects its population far better and therefore engages with it. So final point, the point about impact is not so much about impact. I think the only thing about the impact agenda, well, the few things I don't like, but one of the things I hate is the word. It's a terrible word. Engagement or liaison or reciprocity or something that would be much, much, much better. And you put it beautifully yourself. The thing not to do is to go out and do impact to people. But that is absolutely not what the impact agenda is about. Now, I know this because I've spent a lot of time working with Stephen Hill and HEFKI and researching that was now over the whole interdisciplinary era, because it was awful for that, and it's still siloed in units of assessment. But this time is so much better, and partly because there was a very deep, and has been for years, engagement with the academic community by the REF team. And so what it's about, from where I'm sitting, it's about incentivising the inside-out university. It's about incentivising projects, research that from the very beginning don't draw divisions or draw up the drawbridge between academics and a wide and colourful publics, but actually engage enormously broad communities outside academia in our research from the very beginning. Now, if and when you do that, you don't have a problem. I'm also going to say you don't need impact artists. You do, because it's wonderful to have, because you can help us with that stage. But projects in which a user community has started 10 years ago, formulating the very research questions. You don't have to worry about the impact case study. It writes itself. And it's so good because you recruit, it sort of does, because you have other people with non-academic minds who are, let's face it, often brighter than we are, have different agendas, different experiences. All that enriches our research. It doesn't draw away from it. So that's a few pointers to a very different narrative that I think does have to be spoken about impact.
But all I would say to that is that we have that, and it's called a university, if we do it right. And this is when we should be able to talk about the impact we have on our students. That actually doing research with students is what we do all day, every day. It's what happens in our classrooms, it's what we do in our brilliant modules, it's where we get the students in. If we have a properly diverse classroom, if we respect those voices, if we get them in, then it is our students who write to me 10 years, 15 years after the fact and say, I remember that lecture you did and it has changed my life. I remember that and it happened. We have impact in the arts and humanities in these extraordinary ways, and we're not allowed to count it. We're not allowed to talk about it. We're not allowed to call it impact.
I don't disagree with that. I'm saying that there are other narratives we can say about the research side.
Okay. We've got time for one more question.
I've been thinking about this for the past week because I've done some work with the Russell Group. We're far too supine as a sector at accepting the metrics that are set upon us. You can talk about anything you want, Helen, and if you tell us the story, we'll tell it for you as well. So that wasn't my major point. It was if students come to you, my provocation to end the day is we need to do far more in the arts and humanities to do what scientists have been doing for donkey's years, which is to take the story to where the audience is, and to take the story to those multicultural schools and excite them as much about the arts and humanities as we do about sciences, and actually to do it in combination where science and art meet, to encourage kids who don't feel empowered and don't feel they've got the permission to consider becoming a professor in an English department in quite the same way that they might if they were given the opportunity. So that was really my provocation.
I think that's an excellent note on which to draw the formal part of the proceedings to a close. So we can continue these discussions upstairs over refreshments. But can we thank both Helen and Tom for a fascinating session?